The year is 1946. A woman sits in a chair in a doctor's office. She has been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, perhaps schizophrenia. Her family has brought her here as a last resort. Have you heard this doctor can help when nothing else works? The doctor is charming, confident, reassuring. He tells her the procedure will take just 10 minutes. No anesthesia necessary, well, maybe some electroshock to render her unconscious. No surgical theater, no sterile operating room required. He can do this right here, right now. He pulls out what looks like an ice pick, because it is an ice pick, or rather, a modified instrument based on one. He calls it a lobotomy. He places it above her eye, in the eye socket, just above the eyeball. Then he taps it with a hammer, driving it through the thin bone at the top of the eye socket into her brain. He wiggles it back and forth, severing the connections in her frontal lobe. Then he does the same on the other side. 10 minutes later, she is awake, groggy, confused, but awake. The doctor declares the procedure a success. In a few days, he says, her mental illness will be cured. This is a transorbital lobotomy, and the doctor performing it on thousands of patients across America is Walter Freeman, urologist, innovator, showman, and one of the most controversial figures in medical history. But here is what makes Freeman's story politically significant, what makes it relevant to this channel. Walter Freeman didn't just perform lobotomies on ordinary Americans. He had access to the highest levels of power. He advised politicians, influenced mental health policy, and performed his procedure on the sister of a future president. His work shaped how America treated mental illness for decades, and his influence reached into the White House itself. This is the story of how a charismatic doctor with an ice pick became one of the most influential medical figures of the 20th century, despite practicing what many now consider a form of medical barbarism. It's a story about the seduction of simple solutions to complex problems, about how pseudoscience can gain legitimacy through political connections, and about the dangers of giving too much power to medical authorities who claim to have all the answers. Walter Freeman performed or supervised more than 500 lobotomies during his career. Many patients were left permanently damaged, childlike, motionless, unable to care for themselves. Some died on the operating table or shortly after. But Freeman genuinely believed he was helping people, curing mental illness, and advancing medical science. And for a time, much of America believed him too. Lobotomy won a Nobel Prize. It was covered admiringly in newspapers and magazines. It was seen as modern scientific progressive. Presidents didn't publicly endorse it, but their advisors knew about it. Their families used it. And Freeman's influence on mental health policy shaped how America institutionalized and treated the mentally ill. To understand how this happened, how a procedure we now see as barbaric became mainstream medicine, we need to understand Walter Freeman, who he was, how he thought, and how he gained access to political power. Who was Walter Freeman? Walter Jackson Freeman, Roman II, was born in 1895 into a prominent Philadelphia medical family. His grandfather, William Williams Keene, was one of America's most distinguished surgeons, a pioneer in brain surgery, a professor at Jefferson Medical College, and a physician to presidents. This pedigree mattered. Freeman grew up surrounded by medical prestige, with a famous surgeon grandfather who embodied the heroic doctor who could cut into the human body and fix what was broken. Young Walter absorbed the message: surgical intervention could solve previously unsolvable problems. Freeman was brilliant, ambitious, and restless. He graduated from Yale, then earned his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1920. He specialized in neurology, the study of the nervous system and brain, at a time when neurology was a frustrating field. Neurologists could diagnose brain problems but could rarely treat them effectively. Mental illness was particularly vexing. In the 1920s and 1930s, American psychiatric hospitals were warehouses for the mentally ill. Hundreds of thousands of people diagnosed with schizophrenia, depression, mania, or simply labeled as difficult or deviant were locked in overcrowded institutions with no effective treatments. Doctors tried various approaches: cold water baths, fever therapy, insulin shock-induced seizures. Nothing worked reliably. Freeman became chief of neurology at George Washington University Hospital in Washington, D.C. in 1924, at just 29 years old. He was a rising star in American medicine, working in the nation's capital, surrounded by political power. And he was frustrated. He saw patients suffering with mental illness that he couldn't treat. He saw psychiatric hospitals full of people who would never get better. He wanted to do something, anything that might help. Freeman was also a showman. He loved attention, loved being the center of events. He performed autopsies for medical students with theatrical flair, using a large blade he called his Diener, the German word for servant. He took photographs obsessively, documenting his procedures, his patients, his travels. He cultivated relationships with journalists, getting his work featured in newspapers and magazines. This combination: brilliant doctor, frustrated by untreatable illness, ambitious for recognition, guilt at publicity, made Freeman receptive when he heard about a radical new procedure being developed in Europe: lobotomy, later called lobotomy. In 1935, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Manes reported that he had developed a surgical procedure to treat mental illness. By cutting the connections between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain, Manes claimed he could cure patients with severe depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. Freeman was electrified. Here was a treatment that actually did something. that intervened directly in the brain, that offered hope where there had been none. In 1936, Freeman and his colleague James Watts performed America's first lobotomy. The procedure was adapted from Mani's technique. They drilled holes in the patient's skull and cut the neural connections in the frontal lobe. Freeman was convinced he had found a miracle cure, and he set about promoting it with evangelical fervor. The birth of lobotomy, Monist to Freeman. To understand why lobotomy seemed like a reasonable idea in the 1930s, you need to understand the state of psychiatry and the theory of brain function that prevailed at the time. The theory went like this. Mental illness was caused by overactive neural circuits in the brain. Patients with obsessive thoughts, overwhelming anxiety, or delusional thinking had circuits that were firing too intensely, creating abnormal mental states. If you could interrupt those circuits, you could relieve the symptoms. This theory was based on limited understanding of how the brain actually worked. Neuroscience in the 1930s was primitive by modern standards. Doctors knew the brain was divided into regions with different functions, but they didn't understand the complex interconnections, the neurochemistry, or the nuanced ways that different brain areas communicated. Antonio Egas Moniz, working in Portugal, theorized that cutting the connections between the frontal lobes, which he associated with higher order thinking and emotional regulation and other parts of the brain, might calm patients with severe mental illness. Frontal lobes, he believed, were where abnormal thoughts originated. Sever the connections, and you interrupt the pathological circuits. Moniz tried it on patients with severe depression and psychosis. He reported remarkable results. Agitated patients became calm, depressed patients showed improvement, psychotic patients became more manageable. He published his findings, and the procedure attracted international attention. Freeman read Moniz's papers with growing excitement. Here was a biological intervention for mental illness, something that addressed the brain directly rather than just talking to patients or locking them up. Freeman adapted Moniz's technique with his colleague James Watts, a neurosurgeon. Together, they developed the Freeman-Watts procedure, a standardized approach to lobotomy. They drilled burr holes into the patient's skull on both sides, inserted a cutting instrument called the Lobotomy, and severed the white matter connections in the frontal lobe. The procedure was crude by any standard. They couldn't see what they were cutting. They couldn't precisely control which connections were severed. But Freeman reported positive results. Patients who had been institutionalized for years became calm enough to go home. Severely depressed patients showed emotional improvement. Silent patients became docile. There were obvious downsides. Many patients emerged from the surgery with diminished personality, reduced initiative, and childlike emotional responses. They became passive, dependent, less capable of complex thinking. Some had severe complications, seizures, infections, personality changes so severe they couldn't function independently. But in the context of 1930s psychiatry, these outcomes seemed acceptable. The alternative for many patients was lifetime institutionalization with no hope of improvement. A lobotomized patient who was calm and manageable, even if permanently changed, seemed better than a patient who would spend decades locked in an overcrowded psychiatric hospital. Freeman genuinely believed he was helping people. He saw patients who had suffered for years find relief. He saw families grateful to have their relatives back, even if changed. He believed the benefits outweighed the costs. And crucially, the medical establishment agreed with him, at least initially. In 1949, Antonio Egas Moniz won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for developing the lobotomy procedure. This Nobel Prize gave lobotomy scientific legitimacy. If the Nobel Committee endorsed it, how bad could it be? Freeman was emboldened. He became lobotomy's greatest champion in America, promoting it aggressively, training other doctors to perform it, and seeking ways to make it even more accessible. That is, when he developed the technique that would make him truly infamous, the transorbital lobotomy, reformed through the eye socket with an instrument that resembled an ice pick. The transorbital technique, innovation or madness. The standard lobotomy procedure required a neurosurgeon, an operating room, anesthesia, and drilling holes in the skull. This made it expensive, time-consuming, and available only to patients who could access specialized surgical facilities. Freeman wanted to make lobotomy faster, cheaper, and more widely available. He believed millions of Americans might benefit from the procedure, but the surgical requirements were a barrier. So he developed a shortcut, the transorbital lobotomy. The concept was based on anatomy. The top of the eye socket, the thin bone separating the eye from the brain, is one of the thinnest parts of the skull. If you could insert an instrument through this bone, you could access the frontal lobe without drilling. Freeman experimented with cadavers, developing his technique. He used a modified lobotomy, essentially an ice pick that could be tapped through the orbital bone with a small hammer. Once through the bone, he would sweep the instrument back and forth, severing the frontal lobe connections. The procedure took about 10 minutes. It required no surgical theater, no neurosurgeon, no anesthesia beyond some electroshock to render the patient unconscious. Freeman could perform it in his office, in psychiatric hospitals, even in hotel rooms during his cross-country promotional tours. Freeman first performed the transorbital lobotomy in 1946 after his partner James Watts refused to participate. Watts was horrified by the crude technique and the lack of surgical precision. He thought it was medical barbarism. The partnership dissolved, with Watts condemning Freeman's methods. But Freeman was undeterred. He believed the transorbital approach was a breakthrough. It democratized lobotomy, making it available available to patients who could never afford traditional brain surgery. He performed the procedure on patient after patient, documenting results, taking photographs, promoting the technique. He became a traveling lobotomist, driving across America in a van he called the Lobotomobile, visiting state psychiatric hospitals and performing mass lobotomies. He would do 10, 20, sometimes more procedures in a single day, moving from patient to patient with an assembly line efficiency that shocked some observers. Freeman's showmanship reached its peak during these demonstrations. He would perform the procedure with flair, sometimes using both hands to insert ice picks into both eye sockets simultaneously. He took photographs of every procedure, yielding an enormous archive of lobotomy patients. He gave lectures, wrote articles, and courted media attention. The press loved him. Newspapers ran stories about the miracle cure for mental illness. Magazines featured Freeman as an innovator, a pioneer, a doctor who cared enough to try radical solutions. The Saturday Evening Post, Life magazine, and others gave lobotomy positive coverage. Freeman's promotional success was built on selective reporting of results. He highlighted cases where patients improved, became calmer, more manageable, able to leave institutions. He downplayed cases where patients were severely damaged, became permanently childlike, or died from complications. He also redefined success in ways that suited his narrative. Patient who went from violent and institutionalized to passive and manageable was a success, even if they lost the ability to work, maintain relationships, or live independently. A patient who no longer required expensive hospitalization was a success, even if they needed lifelong care from family members. Modern analysis of Freeman's records tells a darker story. Many patients were harmed by the procedure. Some died. Many were left with severe personality changes, reduced cognitive abilities, and inability to function independently. Success rates, when honestly assessed, were far lower than Freeman claimed. But in the 1940s and early 1950s, lobotomy's dangers weren't widely known or acknowledged. Freeman was seen as a pioneer, and his technique was spreading across America. And crucially for our story, Freeman had connections to political power that helped legitimize his work and influence mental health policy. Political connections, access to power. Walter Freeman operated at the intersection of medicine and politics in Washington, D.C. for decades. His position at George Washington University Hospital, his charismatic personality, and his connections through his prominent medical family gave him access to powerful political figures. Freeman didn't directly advise presidents on policy in the formal sense. He wasn't a White House physician or an official government consultant, but he moved in circles where political power operated. He treated the families of politicians, corresponded with public health officials, influenced the doctors who did advise government, and shaped the broader conversation about mental health treatment in America. His influence operated through several channels. First, through the medical establishment. Freeman trained numerous psychiatrists and neurologists in lobotomy techniques. These doctors went on to positions in state mental health systems, veterans hospitals, and academic medicine. They carried Freeman's ideas about aggressive biological intervention for mental illness into the institutions they led. Second, through elite social networks. Freeman treated patients from Washington's social elite. He performed lobotomies on the family members of congressmen, diplomats, and wealthy families with political connections. These weren't public cases. Medical confidentiality protected the families, but they created networks of grateful families who saw Freeman as a miracle worker. Third, through public health policy. Freeman advocated for expanded use of lobotomy in state psychiatric hospitals and veterans facilities. He argued that lobotomy could reduce the enormous costs of long-term psychiatric hospitalization. This economic argument appealed to government officials looking for ways to manage overcrowded state mental hospitals. Fourth, through media and public opinion. Freeman's tireless self-promotion shaped how Americans thought about mental illness and its treatment. The positive media coverage of lobotomy influenced public opinion, which in turn influenced political willingness to fund psychiatric research and support aggressive treatments. Freeman corresponded with the U.S. Public Health Service about using lobotomy in federal facilities. He consulted with the Veterans Administration about treating shell-shocked soldiers returning from World War II. He wrote to state health commissioners advocating for lobotomy programs. He wasn't making policy directly, but he was influencing the people who did. He was shaping the intellectual framework that policymakers used when thinking about mental health. Freeman also benefited from the broader political context of the 1940s and 1950s. This was an era of aggressive medical intervention, of faith in technological solutions, of belief that science could solve any problem. Lobotomy fit this zeitgeist perfectly. It was modern scientific interventionist. It promised to solve the intractable problem of serious mental illness through surgical innovation. Politicians didn't need to understand the neuroscience or evaluate Freeman's data carefully. It just needed to believe that experts had found a solution, and Freeman was very good at presenting himself as an expert with solutions. Of Freeman's most significant political connection, and the one that reveals most clearly the intersection of his medical practice and political power, involves one of America's most prominent families, the Kennedys, the Rosemary Kennedy case. In 1941, Rosemary Kennedy, the intellectually disabled sister of future President John F. Kennedy, underwent a lobotomy. He was 23 years old. Procedure was performed by Walter Freeman and James Watts. It was a catastrophic failure that left Rosemary severely incapacitated for the rest of her life. This case deserves careful examination because it reveals how lobotomy was used, how families made decisions about it, and how political power interacted with medical authority. Rosemary Kennedy was born in 1918. The third child of Joseph and Rose Kennedy. From early childhood, it was clear she had intellectual disabilities. The exact nature of her condition is debated. Some historians believe she had mild intellectual disability. Others suggest she may have had mental illness in addition to cognitive challenges. What's clear is that Rosemary struggled in ways her siblings did not. He had difficulty with academic work, social situations, and emotional regulation. As she entered her early 20s, her behavior became more challenging. He had mood swings, sometimes became aggressive, and showed interest in men that her father found inappropriate. Joseph Kennedy, the family patriarch and a powerful political figure himself, found Rosemary's behavior increasingly unacceptable. He worried about scandal, about how an intellectually disabled daughter might affect his sons' political careers. He wanted her fixed. He consulted with doctors and eventually learned about lobotomy. Freeman and Watts had been promoting the procedure for years, claiming remarkable results. Kennedy was told that lobotomy could calm Rosemary, reduce her mood swings, and make her more manageable. The decision to proceed was made by Joseph Kennedy, apparently without fully consulting his wife Rose or his other children. He arranged for Freeman and Watts to perform the procedure in November 1941. The operation was a disaster. Instead of simply becoming calmer, Rosemary was left profoundly incapacitated. Her cognitive abilities, already limited, were further reduced. He could no longer walk or speak intelligibly. He required institutional care for the rest of her life, living until 2005 in a facility in Wisconsin. The Kennedy family kept Rosemary's lobotomy secret for decades. He was rarely mentioned publicly. When asked about her, the family said she was teaching mentally disabled children or was living quietly due to illness. The truth about what happened to her didn't become public until the 1980s. This case reveals several important truths about lobotomy and political power. First, lobotomy was used as a tool of social control. Rosemary was psychotic or severely mentally ill. He was intellectually disabled and had behavioral challenges that embarrassed her family. The lobotomy was performed not primarily to help Rosemary, but to make her easier to manage and less of a potential scandal. Second, powerful families had access to cutting-edge medical procedures for better or worse. The Kennedys could afford the best doctors and the newest treatments, but in this case access to Freeman's services was devastating rather than helpful. Third, the complete failure of Rosemary's lobotomy didn't stop Freeman's career or diminish his political influence. The Kennedy family's power and their desire for secrecy meant the case wasn't publicized. Freeman continued his work, and the Kennedys never publicly criticized him or warned others about the dangers of lobotomy. Fourth, the case shows how medical authority can override patient welfare when families have other agendas. There is no evidence Rosemary consented to the procedure. He may not have been capable of meaningful consent. The decision was made for her by a father concerned about family reputation and political prospects. When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, his administration actually made significant advances in mental health policy, establishing community mental health centers, reducing reliance on institutional psychiatry, and promoting more humane treatment of the mentally ill. Some historians speculate that JFK's approach was influenced by guilt over what happened to his sister. But during the Kennedy presidency, the family never publicly discussed Rosemary's lobotomy. They never warned about Freeman's techniques. They never advocated for restricting the procedure. Their silence allowed Freeman to continue his work. The Rosemary Kennedy case is the clearest example of Freeman's proximity to political power. He performed a lobotomy on a president's sister. The catastrophic outcome was covered up by one of America's most powerful families, and Freeman faced no professional consequences, continuing to perform thousands more lobotomies over the following decades, selling lobotomy to America. Walter Freeman's success in promoting lobotomy depended on his skill as a salesman. He understood that medical innovation requires more than just technical expertise. It requires convincing doctors, patients, families, and the public that your approach works. Freeman's sales strategy had several elements. Scientific legitimacy. Freeman published extensively in medical journals, presented at conferences, and trained other doctors in his techniques. He created an aura of scientific rigor around lobotomy, even though his data was often cherry-picked and his follow-up studies were inadequate. Emotional appeals. Freeman told compelling stories about patients who had suffered for years and then found relief through lobotomy. He photographed patients before and after procedures, showing transformation from agitated to calm. These before and after images were powerful, even though they didn't reveal long-term outcomes or complications. Economic arguments. Freeman emphasized that lobotomy could save enormous amounts of money by allowing patients to leave expensive psychiatric institutions. In an era when state mental hospitals were overcrowded and underfunded, this economic case was persuasive to administrators and legislators. Democratization rhetoric. Freeman portrayed himself as bringing treatment to the masses. His transorbital technique, he argued, made lobotomy available to patients who could never afford traditional brain surgery. He was helping the poor and working class, not just wealthy patients who could access elite medical care. Media savvy. Freeman cultivated relationships with journalists and actively sought media coverage. He provided reporters with dramatic stories, compelling photographs, and access to procedures. The resulting positive press coverage shaped public perception of lobotomy as modern and scientific. Medical authority. Freeman's credentials, his prestigious family background, his position at George Washington University, his extensive publications gave him credibility that he leveraged relentlessly. When he said lobotomy worked, people believed him because he was a prominent doctor from a famous medical family. Freeman's promotional tours were particularly effective. He would visit state psychiatric hospitals, often in rural areas with limited access to specialized treatment. He would offer to perform lobotomies for free or at low cost, demonstrating his technique to local doctors and staff. He would photograph the procedures and the patients, yielding his case that lobotomy worked. These demonstrations were theatrical. Freeman understood the power of spectacle. He would perform multiple lobotomies in quick succession, showing how fast and simple the procedure was. Local doctors, impressed by his confidence and his results, would adopt the technique themselves. Freeman kept meticulous records, ultimately documenting more than 500 lobotomies that he personally performed or supervised. But his record keeping was selective. He tracked outcomes that interested him primarily, whether patients became calmer and more manageable. He didn't systematically track cognitive decline, emotional blunting, or the many cases where patients were severely harmed. When patients did poorly, Freeman often blamed other factors. The underlying mental illness was too severe. The patient wasn't followed up properly. Family members didn't provide adequate care. He rarely acknowledged that the lobotomy itself might have caused a poor outcome. Freeman also adapted his claims about what lobotomy could treat. Initially promoted for severe depression and schizophrenia, lobotomy was eventually marketed as appropriate for a far wider range of problems: anxiety, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, chronic pain, even simple nonconformity. Freeman performed lobotomies on children, on elderly patients, on people whose main problem seemed to be that they were difficult or didn't conform to social expectations. This expansion of indications is common when a medical procedure is driven more by advocacy than by evidence. When your primary goal is promoting a treatment you believe in, every problem starts to look like something that treatment could solve. Freeman's promotional success depended on the broader cultural context. America in the 1940s and 1950s was optimistic about medical progress, trusting of expert authority, and convinced that science could solve any problem. Lobotomy fit this worldview perfectly. It was modern, scientific, and promised miracle cures. But by the late 1950s, the tide was beginning to turn. The decline and backlash. Several factors converged in the late 1950s and 1960s to end lobotomy's dominance in American psychiatry. First, better treatments emerged. In the 1950s, pharmaceutical companies developed the first effective psychiatric medications. Fluoropromazine, Thorazine, and other antipsychotic drugs could control symptoms of schizophrenia without surgery. Antidepressants helped many patients with severe depression. These medications weren't perfect, but they offered alternatives to lobotomy. Second, evidence of harm accumulated. As more patients were followed long-term, the severe downsides of lobotomy became impossible to ignore. Many patients had permanent cognitive impairment, emotional blunting, and inability to function independently. Death rates from the procedure were significant, and success rates, when honestly assessed, were far lower than Freeman claimed. Third, medical ethics evolved. The post-World War Roman II period brought increased attention to medical ethics and patient rights. The Nuremberg trials revealed horrific medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors. This led to new emphasis on informed consent, careful evaluation of medical risks and benefits, and protection of vulnerable patients. Lobotomy, which was often performed on institutionalized patients who couldn't meaningfully consent, began to look like a violation of medical ethics. Fourth, psychiatric hospitals began to close. The deinstitutionalization movement of the 1960s and 1970s aimed to move patients out of large psychiatric hospitals and into community care. Patients weren't locked in institutions. The argument that lobotomy could help them leave became less relevant. Fifth, public opinion shifted. Books and films began to portray lobotomy not as a miracle cure, but as a horror. Ken Kesey's novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1962, depicted lobotomy as a tool of oppressive social control. The 1975 film adaptation brought this critique to a mass audience. Lobotomy became associated not with medical progress but with psychiatric abuse. Freeman himself contributed to the backlash through his own actions. In 1967, he performed a lobotomy on a patient named Helen Mortensen, her third lobotomy by Freeman. He died from a brain hemorrhage caused by the procedure. Freeman's hospital privileges were revoked, effectively ending his career. But even before this final disaster, Freeman had become increasingly marginalized. Younger psychiatrists viewed his methods as barbaric. Medical schools stopped teaching lobotomy. Hospitals stopped allowing the procedure. By the 1960s, the number of lobotomies performed in America had plummeted from thousands per year to just a handful. Freeman spent his final years traveling and corresponding with former patients, trying to document positive outcomes and defend his legacy. He believed until his death in 1972 that he had helped people, that his critics were wrong, that history would vindicate him. He was partially right about one thing. Some patients and families remained grateful to him. For certain individuals with severe, treatment-resistant mental illness, lobotomy did provide relief when nothing else worked. These cases were far outnumbered by the patients who were harmed, the people who underwent irreversible brain damage for problems that might have been treated less invasively. The final verdict on Freeman is complex. He was not a monster who deliberately hurt people. He genuinely believed he was helping patients, advancing medicine, and alleviating suffering. But his certainty about his methods, his resistance to evidence of harm, and his promotional zeal led him to perform thousands of unnecessary procedures that damaged or killed patients. His political influence, his access to powerful families, his shaping of mental health policy, his impact on how America treated mental illness amplified both his successes and his harms. The same connections that allowed him to help some patients also allowed him to hurt many others without facing accountability. Legacy and modern implications. What lessons does Walter Freeman's story offer for understanding the relationship between medicine, science, and political power? Lesson 1. Medical authority can be dangerous when not properly checked. Freeman operated with enormous autonomy, performing thousands of procedures without adequate oversight or evidence of efficacy. His credentials and connections protected him from scrutiny that might have stopped or limited his work earlier. Lesson 2. Political connections amplify both good and bad medical innovations. Freeman's access to powerful families and policymakers helped spread lobotomy, but also prevented critical evaluation of its risks. The same networks that could promote beneficial treatments can also protect harmful ones. Lesson 3. Economic incentives shape medical practice. Lobotomy was promoted partly because it promised to save money by emptying expensive psychiatric hospitals. The economic case for the procedure influenced policy even when the medical case was weak. Lesson 4. Media narratives matter enormously. Freeman's skill at generating positive press coverage shaped public perception of lobotomy for decades. The dramatic before and after stories were persuasive even though they weren't representative of typical outcomes. Lesson 5. Vulnerable populations need special protection. Many lobotomy patients were institutionalized, intellectually disabled, or otherwise unable to advocate for themselves. They underwent irreversible procedures without meaningful consent, often to benefit their families or institutions rather than themselves. Lesson 6. Scientific-sounding claims require rigorous evidence. Freeman wrapped lobotomy in the language of science and progress, but his evidence was anecdotal and selective. The medical establishment accepted his claims without demanding the kind of rigorous proof that should be required for invasive procedures. Modern parallels exist. Consider how psychiatric medications are marketed with claims of correcting chemical imbalances, despite limited evidence for this model. Consider how certain surgical procedures spread rapidly based on enthusiastic early reports before rigorous studies reveal harms. Consider how medical innovations are often promoted to policymakers through personal connections rather than systematic evidence review. The mental health field has learned from the lobotomy era. Modern psychiatry has much stronger emphasis on informed consent, patient rights, evidence-based practice, and careful evaluation of new treatments. The ethical abuses of the lobotomy era contributed to the development of institutional review boards, informed consent requirements, and protection for human research subjects. But elements of Freeman's approach persist. There is still tension between aggressive intervention and conservative treatment. There is still pressure to find quick solutions to complex mental health problems. There is still potential for charismatic doctors with political connections to promote treatments that haven't been adequately validated. Freeman's legacy is ultimately one of caution. His story reminds us that medical progress is not inevitable, that innovations can harm as well as help, and that proximity to political power can allow bad medicine to spread just as easily as good medicine. The thousands of people who underwent lobotomy, including Rosemary Kennedy, paid an enormous price for Freeman's certainty that he had found a miracle cure. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not just as medical history, but as political history, as a reminder of what happens when medical authority meets political power without adequate checks on either. Walter Freeman died in 1972, still defending his life's work. The debate about his legacy continues. Was he a pioneer who helped many people despite the limited tools available, or was he a medical showman whose ambition and certainty led him to harm thousands of vulnerable patients? The answer is probably both. He helped some people, he harmed many, more, and his political connections ensured that by the time the full extent of the harm became clear, thousands of lobotomies had already been performed. That's the real lesson of Walter Freeman. When medicine, politics, and personal ambition intersect without proper oversight, the results can be catastrophic. Patients whose brains he damaged can never be made whole, but their stories can teach us to be more skeptical of medical claims, more protective of vulnerable patients, and more careful about giving doctors unchecked authority over the minds and bodies of others.